can join us virtually. We're going to show an excerpt of his film, and then he's going to join us virtually.
Right, I'll send it to the file we list. Go back and give you that film, the Untitled World.
Hello, folks. My name is Dean, and I am called the, what am I called? Music director and fake minister, and a couple other titles like bottle washer and of Community Church of Boston, this building where you are right now. And we are so thrilled to be spending a weekend to kick off this gallery display of the paintings of Diane Esmond, and we're so. It's just the crew did a whole lot of tidying up for company, and it's still kind of a little bit unkempt, but we hope that we're really happy that we did it because during COVID it was a flop house you wouldn't believe. Anyway. We are so honored to welcome Patricia Helletzgruber. I hope I didn't butcher your name, Patricia. And I just want to start by saying that before you go, take a copy of one of our newsletters. We have a bunch of wonderful stuff coming up in this space as well as virtually. And we hope you will also join our mailing list, and we'll send you probably too much email, but announcements that we're so excited to host lots of different wonderful speakers on topics of serious import. I meant to have this last night, but I didn't because my friend Bill Burnett, who wrote this poem, didn't email it to me on time, but I have it now and I want to read it. It's called Eke Out Something Beautiful. If you can eke out something beautiful, if you can scratch out something true, if you can work out something wonderful, then God bless you. Circle of chords, garble of words, you're looking for something never heard, splashes of paint on a canvas bare, you're hoping for beauty when nothing is there, your body, your lonely hand reaching for the empty page, and you're the frightened man stepping out on the empty stage. But if you can eke out something beautiful, if you can scratch out something true, if you can work out something wonderful, God bless you. Packet of seeds, parcel of land, it's time to start digging in your garden again. Water and stone, hammer and wood. You got to build something and you're hoping it's good and you pray the rain won't pass your garden by or that roof you strained to build will keep you dry. But if you can eke out something beautiful, if you can scratch out something true, if you can work out something wonderful, God bless you. God bless you, God bless you. Circle of days, circle of years. Everything blooms, then disappears. Circle of hands, circle of friends. Everything comes around again. Everything blooms and dies and comes around again. Maybe soon your star will rise, but until then, if you can eke out something beautiful, if you can scratch out something true, if you can work out something wonderful, God bless you. And if you can help the world turn round again, look at something new, if you can eke out something beautiful, then God bless you. Bill Burnett, my hero. He's a Los Angeles songwriter. Someday I'll learn it and sing it to you, but to read it is wonderful too. So I want to welcome Victor Wallace. Victor and Inez have been here a whole lot, just put in an enormous amount of effort putting up this show, and I hope this is also a template for a future possibilities at Community Church for us to do all kinds of visual programs right here in Copley Square. So thanks again for joining us, and thank you virtual folks for joining us as well. And Victor is going to tell us a little bit about his mom and about Patricia. Victor Wallace.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you so much. This really represents another stage in the evolution of my mother's career, let's say, since the time of her death, now more than 40 years ago. And I have to say that I'm enormously happy that this exhibition is taking place in an institution like this, like the Community Church of Boston, with its commitment to social justice and with the enormous energy and creativity of Dean Stevens, and also with the great help of Crystal Rollins Jackson, who I must credit for the title given to this exhibition, Spaces, what is it? Refuge and Resiliency, Spaces of, what does it, say it again? Anyway.
Let me go scurrying from the postcard.
Yeah, no,
Title of this thing before.
yeah, anyway. Spaces of Refuge and Resiliency. Right. The Luminous Art of Diane Esmond. That's the complete the complete title. And so and I have to also say that in the preparation of this project, Inez, my life partner, has played an incomparable role. I would say she's done more work than I have on it, I have to confess. And she's encouraged me at every point and been very creative and practical and inspirational altogether in this. I also, and this sort of begins to get me into the substance, and I'll just tell you that I'm going to say a few sort of background things, then introduce Patricia, and then again I'll pick up the story where it breaks off in Patricia's account. But I do want to acknowledge my brother Spencer, because I'm in the position of having been the sole direct representative of my mother. But my brother, who was born 4 years later than me, he took his life a year after my mother died. And the story that accounts for that is part of the drama of my mother's life also. Because in a sense, of course, she lived most of her life in France, except for the period of exile that began in 1940 and ended in the mid-50s, and after which she returned to France. But this was a very unhappy period of her life, and he was born early in that period. And some of his life and the conflicts reflect that. And so the result was, without it going into great detail, that although he finished his education in the United States, because she had gone back to France, he went back to France. I had, I guess, the advantage of being a little older and of having already distanced myself from the situation, the circumstances of our upbringing, so that I was in a position to stay in the United States and also in terms of relationship with my mother, have this amazing correspondence, because she was back in France, I was here, I was away at school, and we started writing letters, and I have the last 25 years of her life I have recorded in her letters to me, which I saved, and which actually Patricia has read all those letters that I have. And so it's a remarkable testimony, both about our relationship and about my mother herself, and explains a little bit of both of who I am and who she is. But in short, my brother and I had both been raised, the day-to-day work of raising us was not done by my mother, it was done by a professional nanny. And for me, this was something that made me look critically at the whole situation of power relationships in the household. So you might say I felt my critical analysis of society was grounded in early life experience. And I sort of, you might say, intellectualized it perhaps. I became very bookish as a kid. But my brother, by contrast, felt terribly the lack of insufficient closeness, let's say, with our mother. Without going into great details, this was a period, it was difficult for her, not only because of being in a strange place where she didn't feel wanted, but her marriage with my father was not going well, and so on. So all this was reflected for him. But in terms of her and me, what became possible was a correspondence very serious. I guess I would say at a level of mature friends, and it was more or less explicitly stated by that in a letter that she wrote to me on my 17th birthday. And in earlier presentation, I actually gave an earlier presentation here in February, a PowerPoint, where I showed you could read the letter for yourself where she talked about this, and I read it out. And I'm sure you can find it if you go to the CCB for the February when that was held. But so that was something sort of in the background that's very important. So what the letters then allowed me to see was, they provided a record of her, not in great detail, her artistic thinking and her travels especially. So that was very, very important and a major part of her life. So let me just say a little bit by way of also background about my mother, that although she lived most of her life in France, she was born in London. Her father was from British India, her mother from France, both from fairly, let's say, prominent Jewish families, and that was her milieu. And I think that I can say that between how she grew up, the circumstances in which she grew up, and how I developed in terms of especially my political commitments, she was a kind of a transitional stage. Because although she didn't really break away and she didn't have any kind of radical politics, she nonetheless devoted herself with total commitment to her art and was not attracted by the kind of social life that she was expected or would have been expected to lead. And some of the basis for this, again, it's kind of amusing in a way, is that she was the middle of three sisters, and she was thought of by her father as being a son. He wanted a son, and that was designated to be my mother, and she was a great athlete and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, so she was somewhat different from the others in that respect. But in any case, her development as an artist was extraordinary, and provided for what we have here, some of it that we have here. So I think. I won't say any more about my mother's early life. I think at this point, Patricia Helletzgruber can take over the narrative, and then I will speak later about the period since my mother's death in terms of her work. But Patricia got in touch with me 4 years ago based on discoveries that she had made in her scholarship about the Nazi looting of works during their occupation of France. And although she's retired from a career in the world of business, she's been an art historian for the last 10 years, very dedicated to that, and very, well, you'll see, I will let her speak for herself. So I'm very pleased to have her speak to you, Patricia.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here in Boston. I had the good luck to visit the city in my former capacity as executive director of the American Chamber of Commerce in Austria, and I'm really delighted to be back here, and I kind of remember the commons and some of the areas here. This time the reason is for coming to the exposition of paintings by the artist Diane Esmond here in the community church. And I would like to begin by telling you how I found her, or maybe we could say maybe she found me. As Victor has already mentioned, I embarked on the study of the art history at the University of Vienna after Amcham, Austria. And in the fall semester of 2019-20, I took a course on provenance, which focused on colonial and Nazi misappropriations. And my theme was, and I prepared a paper and a presentation on the subject, Dispossession of Cultural Goods in France, ERR, Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. So you'll be asking, who is Rosenberg? Who was Reichsleiter Alfred Ernst Rosenberg? Because he's the center of the disappropriation of very, very many works of art in France, and not only in France, in the whole of Europe. He was born in 1893 in Reval, which is today's Tallinn, which is the capital of Estonia in northern Europe. He developed an early interest in prehistoric archaeology, and barbarian migration periods. And later in his life, this background would launch him to embed racist ideology into the research and teaching of ancient history in Germany. So that was an ideological sort of hitch in which he was able to sort of embed in teaching in Germany. He began to study architecture in Riga, which is in Latvia, also Northern Europe, and after the outwork of World War I, he continued his education in Moscow, Russia, because the university in Riga was closed down and evacuated. And when he was in Russia, he experienced not only the end of the Tsarist rule, but the October Revolution and then the despotism of the Bolsheviks. And by 1918, he had terminated his studies, and he'd moved to Munich, and in the meantime, he had also turned into a fanatic anti-Semite. And early on in his publications, he charted a strong associative correlation between socialism, Bolshevism, and Judaism. In Munich, he could not find employment as an architect, and so he decided to work as a journalist and to educate himself in art history, which he was interested in. And in 1919, he first met with Adolf Hitler, who was, of course, not yet in power at that time, and who impressed him greatly. And he joined the NSDAP, so in German that's Nationalsozialistische Arbeiterpartei. And he was in the party, and he worked as editor of speeches and of party publications, and also as an author of the book, The Myth of the 20th Century, which turned out to be a bestseller of its time, but not because of the quality of the content, but because it was sort of hyped. But people bought it and didn't read it. That's at least what it says in the papers. And in developing his career within the party, in 1927 he was commissioned to establish a National Socialist Culture Organization. So his studies of art had sort of empowered him to be able to do that sort of a job. 6 years later, in 1933, he was promoted to head the Office of Foreign Affairs, which was called the Außenpolitisches Amt der NSDAP. And so it's like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs nowadays. And he gained the rank of a Reichsleiter, which had the same standing as a minister, like a Secretary of Foreign Affairs would be today. And thus he stood in competition with other high-ranking Foreign Affairs Secretary, Joachim von Ribbentrop, whose name you may have heard, and his political and maybe also personal agenda. So you can see that Hitler designated two persons to do more or less the same job, and this was not a single case because that happened in very many other cases as well. And then these two or more persons doing more or less the same job were in competition with one another and either hindering each other or pursuing each other, and that was the way of his keeping control. So we're at the beginning of the World War. The time is now the invasion of Poland on September 1 in 1939, which was followed by the attack on Denmark and Norway in 1940. And in 1940, on May 10, it was Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg who were invaded. And now comes the important date, June 14, 1940, when the Germans marched into Paris, which had been surrendered by the French and occupied northern France. Shortly after, Rosenberg contacted Hitler and was authorized, that was his request, to search for valuable writings and scripts for German museums and French libraries, archives, and church authorities. And he was authorized to have them confiscated by the German police. And very soon these appropriations, which started at a pretty fast pace, they were expanded to an absolutely reckless plundering of all objects and works of art in France and mainly Paris, of course, to start with, of musical instruments, jewelry, silver, porcelain, liturgical equipment, and archaeological findings, as for instance, which was not in France but in Russia, as for instance the never recovered Amber Room which I can tell you about maybe later if you're interested. And the loot which they had collected was consigned to the Deutsche Reich, and the objects that did not meet the expectations or conform to the official aesthetic or ideological ruling of the Nazi were sold, auctioned, or given in exchange to other works, and preferably old masters, because Hitler liked old masters, and they were sort of, the level which he wanted to have. Now let's have a quick look how the books and artwork were treated in Germany at that time. In 1937, Joseph Goebbels, the politician, a very high politician in Germany, initiated the exhibition of degenerate art. And it showed 650 artworks by German modernists and also internationally renowned artists such as Marc Chagall or Pablo Picasso and Paul Gauguin and Wassily Kandinsky, just to give you an example. And the works had been confiscated now from 32 German museums and were now touring the country and were seen by more than 2 million Germans. There was another exposition running at the same time where way fewer persons went. So people went to see the degenerate art, so it was really quite a success. And at the same time, about 16,000 modern artworks were confiscated, and the so-called cleansing of German art collections started. This was not the end either, because further appropriations of museums followed, and approximately 20,000 artworks by 1,400 artists were then sequestered, deposited in storehouses, seized by political rulers, German rulers desirous of their art, so they took them, auctioned to get the money, or stolen by Germans again for themselves, hidden, stowed away, and obliterated. Such as, for instance, on March 20 in 1939, in a catastrophic conflagration, the stock of the unsold artworks was burned in Berlin-Kreuzberg by the fire department, which was pretending it was a practice, destroying approximately 5,000 paintings, sculptures, sketches, watercolors, and drawings. And this had followed the burning of the books which had taken place before, by authors who were not accepted as dutiful citizens or writers. And in Paris, on July 21 in 43, so 4 years later, already at the time when Diane had been able to leave the country, an inventory of about 650 looted valuable paintings and drawings were destroyed by the ERR. And these pictures were torn, cut, or kicked out of their frames and burned in the yard of the Jeu de Paume. And the Jeu de Paume is a museum right near the Louvre, and it was there where they were being kept, so to say, in hostage, the pictures. And according to Anja Heuss, who is, so to say, the godmother of my being able to find Diane, because she's the author of Loot of Art and Cultural Goods, two artists were especially affected by the plundering of artworks. She says Alexandra Oxant and Diane Esmond. And in her book from the year 2000, Anja Heuss writes thus: "The annihilation of the artwork of these two artists was nearly perfect. Today, there's not much to be investigated about them." So reading this in 2019, I thought, well, I'll begin researching on both artists, and I found them both. And most luckily, I was successful in finding Diane's son, Victor, which is the reason why I'm here today. And with the invaluable assistance of Victor and Ines, I have been able to gain an overview of Diane Esmond's artistic oeuvre, and will share with you now some observations that I've made so far. So the artwork, let's speak about the artwork. On her website, you will find a wide variety of themes in her oeuvre. And while working on the Catalogue Raisonné, it was interesting for me to discover how the subjects and the style of painting changed in the course of the years. So how was the flow? I'm starting before the war with her paintings, chronologically. So in the 30s, when Diane was about 20, she studied with the young French artist Edouard McAvoy. He came, I believe, from Scotland, Ireland. Yeah, but he came from a Huguenot family, so yeah, so that's why he's got the Mac there. And she studied also at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière in Paris. McAvoy sold his first paintings at the age of 19, so he was a very young and rising star, and started off with landscapes, cities, and portraits, and then decided to specialize in portraiture, for which he was then later much renowned. He made portraits of personalities such as the painters Pablo Picasso, Marc Chagall, for heads of state like President Charles de Gaulle from France and John F. Kennedy, and from Pope John XXIII, as well as pop singers. He was also the president of the Salon d'Automne, which is the fall exposition in Paris, for more than 30 years until his death in 91. And Diane presented a very large canvas, as she writes, to the Salon d'Automne in the Grand Palais, which is a very big museum in the center of Paris, near the Place d'Étoile, in Paris in October 1970. So she probably re-met her old teacher. Diane's first paintings date between approximately 1935 and 40, and according to the titles and the few remaining photos which we have, we know that these were figurative creations. And the subjects were circus and genre scenes, cabaret scenes, artists, and portraits. We have no information whether she has been already exhibiting in galleries at that time, but we do know that she showed a number of paintings in salons, like the Salon d'Automne, for instance, in between 35 and 38. And in 35, the painting Harlequin et Colombine, which is a harlequin and Columbine, drew interested comments. Likewise, the clown, Le Clown en Gris, which is the clown in gray, which you can see here, and which was inasmuch a very story to itself, because it was looted and then was rescued from a train which was headed for Germany around the time of the liberation of Paris in 1944. And the painting was restituted in 1946 to the family, and later hung for decades in the office of Victor's father in New York. So it has a story to it, and it is now displayed right here for you and in the possession of Victor, and that's where it's going to stay. So that was 1935, the mention, and in 1937, the only newspaper documentation on Diane is the announcement of her marriage on May 5th, and the last item in a magazine newspaper is in 1938 on the Salon International Indépendant, and Diane's paintings are mentioned as notable among the female contributions to the salon. So now I would like to tell you about the looting, which I've already touched before, but go a little more into detail about the year 1940 in France. After the German invasion of France and the takeover of Paris on June 14 in 1940, the aggressors appropriated a number of well-situated buildings for offices and residences for their various agencies and important personalities, because they wanted to live posh, of course. And the Esmond's residence in Paris at 54 Avenue d'Iéna, which is an elegant avenue leading to the Place d'Étoile with the Arc de Triomphe, lived up to the required criteria perfectly. And so, most unfortunately for the family Esmond and all the other residents in the building, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg requisitioned it as a French headquarters for the ERR operation. And thus, all the apartments were commandeered and the tenants evicted and their possession was appropriated. So that was, of course, not to be expected by anybody, and for those, fortunately, those who had left before escaped a worse destiny than if they were managed to have been ready to be out of the country. Edward Esmond's collection of modern paintings, of which were the majority by Diane, was plundered by the ERR. And together with the artwork seized from other houses and collections, it was stored at the Jeu de Paume, Louvre Complex, to be inventoried, assigned to various categories, and crated. And the works would be designated either for German museums, as we have heard, the old masters primarily allotted to Adolf Hitler, who was collecting art for a newly to be planned fine arts museum in Linz in Austria, for he was Austrian born, or for Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, who was also an art lover and setting up his private art collection, which he wanted then he claimed he would make a museum and then donate it to Hitler, which of course never happened, fortunately, and or even for Joseph Goebbels or other political German leaders. And as I mentioned before, the artworks which were not in line with the aesthetic or ideological or political rulings of Nazi Germany would be classified as unacceptable or degenerate and either sold or destroyed. According to the ERR database at the German Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, where all the data has been put together, 57 objects were looted from Edward Esmond's collection, of which over 43 were artworks by Diane. 8 were restituted to the family after the war on March 4, 1946, after the family had made a claim for restitution. The ERR was very diligent and listed the plundered artworks, all plundered artworks, by title and stated the dimensions and technique rather accurately, but had made only 14 photographs of the 43 paintings in this case. Also, it is noted that other works by Diane, such as portraits, still lifes, and landscapes, remained in various storerooms in Paris, of which we have no more information. The Esmonds fled from France in 1940 and traveled by car through Spain and Portugal and then by ship to New York. And during the years in New York, the family life predominated, and Diane felt little inspiration to continue with her artwork, although she had an atelier outside the family apartment. The earliest painting from that time, which we have today, dates from 1949 and pictures a carousel in brightly contrasting hues. She then started making lengthy trips to France after 1945 and moved back to Paris permanently in the mid-50s. The first paintings in Paris, which were from 50 to 54, mainly covered the same themes as the pre-war oeuvre, so that was bar, cabaret, circus, and portraits. In the mid-50s, however, she entered upon a different course and concentrated mainly on still lifes with flowers, fruit, like something like this, for instance, and sometimes with bottles of wine or a coffee machine in an impressionist style, which could be inspired by artists such as Cézanne or Bonnard. She also had a few paintings with the still lifes with the lute, and others which had a slight cubist touch, which would give a touch of bow, which would bow to the early Picasso or Braque. Travels to Italy, south of France, and Haiti sparked her interest in landscape painting and led to works in different styles of Provençal, which we have here to your right. There's Provençal sceneries, and of which she painted many versions in different shades. She had expositions in Paris and in New York, and they generated positive comments in the press and from visitors and provided her satisfaction as well as impetus for further works. In 1959, she did something totally different. She was commissioned to design costumes and the stage set for the play Bérénice in Paris, which was presented by the company of Marie Belle. And she styled traditional costumes in line with the classical theme of the play, And she also produced costumes for the play Christopher Columbus, or Christophe Colomb, for the ensemble directed by Jean-Louis Barrault and Madeleine Renaud, which is in France a very famous regisseur. In the 60s, she took up landscape compositions, which she painted from sketches. So she always made sketches when she was wherever she was traveling, and she took those sketches during her trips to various destinations in France and abroad, and she painted from these. She also loved living in the country and had a studio in Béoust, a small village near Paris, and she felt that her work also profited from the superior life conditions in the country compared to those in the city. Later then, after the 60s, in the following years, she began working in a more abstract style, and I'm citing her. She says, "I'm striving for color simplicity and less figuratif, because the latter really gets on my nerves." And so in the mid-60s, we find a number of compositions of people on the beach, which you can see right at the back of the room, the two above each other, and a bit to the right, there's one more, in bright yellow shades contrasting with dark suntanned figures, or girls sitting in open areas near the water, and again her Provençal landscapes in warm and soft hues, like the one in the middle on your right-hand side. She traveled in the 70s to the Caribbean and to Haiti, and they inspired her to create luminous sceneries and landscapes in strong yellows, in green, and in pastel colors. So there's this is, for instance, these are the colors which she used. And she has a series of large-sized tropical forests in cool blues, turquoise, and green, which impress by their intense coloring and are highly decorative. They are painted in strong brush strokes and are sometimes highlighted in opaque white. So this is a very good example of that kind of a painting. She continued the Caribbean theme in a large series of gouache, which are also brightly pigmented, and these medium-sized compositions in glowing colors show abstract and stylized floral motifs in vivid pinks combined with royal blue and yellow, or dark blue buds on a lemon yellow background, or yet another format with orange yellow figurines seemingly waving at the person who's watching it and looking at it on a multi-layered burgundy red setting. In short, wild and cheerful color combinations. She also turned to inks, and like the gouaches, they were done in the 1970s, and they picture slim trees surrounded and intricately interwoven by delicate flowers and imaginary shrubbery. Her oeuvre mirrors her interest in different techniques, oils, gouaches, and inks, as well as costumes and stage sets. And like many other artists, she started painting figuratively, and in the course of her career, she developed towards more abstract motifs. She continued working regularly until the end of the 70s, but suffered from back pains due to an accident in 78, as well as from pulmonary problems. Her last painting was completed in 1979. It was an abstract oil in turquoise, green, and blue without a title, but reminding strongly of the tropical forest she loved and portrayed so often. She passed away in 1981 in Paris, the city she felt was her home. Her oeuvre was appreciated during her lifetime, but maybe not as much as she might have wished. She was very self-critical about her own painting and strived to grow and develop in her capacity as an artist. She certainly would have been happy to know that her son Victor and Ines are dedicated to make her known among today's art lovers. And I hope that an upcoming catalogue raisonné of her works, which I'm preparing together with an overview of her life, will help to achieve that goal. Thank you very much.
So I want to tell you just a bit about the sequel, because here it was. She died in 1981. I was here. She was over there. All her works were over there. No one there was in a position to do anything about it. But anyway, to make a long story short, the whole collection was put in storage, but then was shipped to us when we settled in Somerville in 1995. And the first big breakthrough in terms of getting it out to the public was thanks to my being on the faculty of the Berklee College of Music. And the first general education and then liberal arts department included all the disciplines, and I got to know the art history faculty quite well. And interestingly enough, because all this, the politics and the art is an interesting mix of things, because at Berklee I maintained an email list of politically interesting items that I sent out to people. And one of the people who expressed enthusiasm for this was the sort of the dean of the art history faculty there, the late Henry Tate. And so, although I didn't see a lot of him, we had a sort of friendly interaction like that. And I kept telling him, oh, would you please come over to see my mother's art? And this sounded sort of like something funny, you know. I mean, everybody says that someone has but I finally persuaded him. And when he came out to see it in Somerville, he was blown away, literally. He said so. He said as much in Somerville. So he curated the first exhibit since her death. This is 9 years ago at the Berklee College of Music. And from that developed, there was all four members of the art history faculty gave talks, and there was an event, and it was filmed. Lara, who was here earlier, did the film of that. And that was when, again, with Inez's help, we set up a website for my mother. And it was thanks to the website that you, Patricia, were able to contact me, because that was getting her out into the world. But then the next stage, so then we have the website, and it goes on and on and on. And I'm busy with my own work, and I'm not going to tell you about that here. But after I'd finally, it's the third book that I put out. There was this is significant in relation to it. There was a Zoom meeting about it, sponsored by the Marxist Education Project in New York. And while we were chatting, I was chatting with Michael Lardner, the director of the project beforehand. I said that what I really wanted to do now was to get people to know my mother's work. And so he said, to my great surprise, why don't you give a talk for the Marxist Education Project, which is something I would never have dreamed of asking about, but I leapt at the opportunity. It was great. And he said, well, every year, the day after Thanksgiving, we have a day in which we do something a little out of the ordinary, so why don't you do that? So this was exactly Thanksgiving a year ago that I gave the presentation, the first presentation about my mother's art, and then after that, here at the Community Church of Boston. But I have to honor Michael Lardner, the director who invited me, who unfortunately died a few months ago. But that was an enormous breakthrough. And I think it expresses in an important way the relevance and the importance of the cultural dimension to the political project that we're all involved with, and that the sensibility that's arrived at and expressed in great art is something that we carry with us in our work on behalf of social justice. So I think that those are the main things that I wanted to bring out. And I think we can have some discussion, questions and answers. You might have some questions either for me or for Patricia. And I thank you for coming and listening.
This way for the question. There we go.
Okay. So, yeah, just hearing you give this wonderful presentation of the lifespan of a painter and the changes that her art underwent in relation to her life, I wanted to point out that at the very end, when all the paintings arrived, there was one set of paintings that still had the odor of paint. They were so fresh, and they were the ones that she painted last. And there are about 6 or 7 of these, and they're all very dark blue like this. Yes. And they're called Dark Forest 1 and 2, Caribbean Night, Blue Night. And, you know, people talk a lot about the end of Monet's life, when he probably couldn't see very well anymore and his style was completely different. But this seems to me an end stage for her, that she's trying to say something about the end of life, and they're very, when you look at them, they're very deep, they're very layered. You can go inside them. So I'd like to know your opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because since I've seen them in nature, I also noticed that, and especially this one. I was thinking that it's not happy. It's not a happy picture. It's sombre. So it really does connect with somebody going towards the end of life. I agree totally. I was thinking that is a late picture. It looks different, and we have so many bright pictures and strong colors, and there's practically no white. She often covers with a little white. If you compare it, like, for instance, with this one, it is totally different. So I think that she probably was, we don't know whether she was, we don't know how she was feeling at the time. And I'm not very much the type of art historian who's going to project any thoughts into what the artist was thinking, because that is absolutely, I don't think that's the right thing to do. But I do think it could mean that she was not, I'm not saying she was unhappy, but she was certainly not cheerful. I would think that she was not cheerful when she was painting this kind of a painting. That would be my interpretation, and I've noticed it also, and it's interesting that you bring it up, because you know the paintings much better than I do, of course. But it is I think it's a very good observation. I agree, absolutely.
I have a question kind of along the same lines, looking at the clown painting, which is also not happy. And I'm wondering what's going on at that time, and is there some social commentary in this? I think you had mentioned she was still in France, and this was just before the Second World War. Okay. Yeah, so I'm wondering if either of you, Patricia or Victor, if you have thoughts about what's going, because it's kind of intriguing that a clown painting is so incredibly somber. And then I have one other question when you finish with that.
It's very hard to say whether she was happy or not at that point in time. I think that maybe it's also interesting that she was also. It was also mentioned at the same time, Harlequin et Colombine. And Harlequin and Colombine, the Harlequin is usually also not a cheerful clown. So maybe she had the impression that the clown is there to make other people happy, but was not happy in his own right. You know, it could be. But I've also noticed, and I agree with you totally, that he looks pensive. And certainly not jolly, but maybe that's what you wanted to draw, that the person who's making other people be happy, or making fun, or bringing joy, at the background of his own being is an unhappy person. And you have the opera of Mascagno, you know, the Pagliaccio. So it's also, you know, he's also sad behind the mask. So it's maybe that's what she wanted to show. That could be. I mean, that would be an interpretation which I would find is legitimate, but we still don't know whether it's what she thought.
I would just add one thing to actually reinforce that she came back to the theme of the clowns later in the 50s also. And there's a wonderful one that actually was sold to a private collector in Denver that you can find on her website, which shows a clown in the bottom corner looking up in the light in the distance with a droopy-looking dog behind it. So it's very much that theme. Yes. Well, you had a question. You had a second question.
Let's lick the other lady and then
yes, yes.
Oh.
All right. Well, just real quickly, this guy Rosenberg, who's
Yes.
sort of leading the, the raid here.
Mm-hmm.
Rosenberg is a Jewish name.
Yes,
So I'm just wondering what's going on there. If you
He is in no way Jewish. He is from, as I mentioned, from I keep forgetting because there are all these Tallinn, and of course they looked into his heritage very, very carefully, and he was no way. Because it's not. That's the first thing everybody thinks about. But he's not. He's German, and I think Finnish. I can't. I can look it up for you later. I have the paper on. I have the original paper which I presented for this. I can look it up for you. I surely got it in more detail. No problem at all.
Sort of two questions. One is a lot of people didn't leave Paris and decided to stay, unfortunately. So maybe Victor knows this more, but why did she leave? I mean, what provoked her to actually decide she was getting out when a lot of other people decided not to? And then secondly, the United States was tended to be the United States and Canada tended not to permit Jews to come. A friend of mine wrote a great book called None is Too Many. And so, again, how did, when the U.S. was turning away so many people who were running from the Nazis, how did they get in?
Do you want?
Yeah, it was her whole family that was leaving. It was not just her decision. I think one thing that may have helped is the fact that because of her father having been from British India, they had British nationality, and that may have facilitated things. But several of her other relatives came. But no, people who could get out, and I think the majority who had the capacity, who had the means to get out, did so. Although in my own family there was one branch which refused and suffered the consequences, but I think most of them who could do so did.
Most certainly, if they were lucky enough, in the sense that they had the clairvoyance to see what a great danger they were in. That is really, absolutely, most absolutely, definitely. That is certainly was, yes, right.
So I have a question. How much of her total work is represented here? Did she sell a lot during her life? Is there a record of a lot of people who own her work in private collections or museums or any place, or is this all a mystery?
I'm not aware of. The only museum I'm aware of is one in England, which then burned down. We read about it recently. Yeah, but a few of her works were sold. They were not commercially successful in any great sense, and we have in our house, another 100 or so, sort of like this. So this is a sample of what we have. And that's about it. So, yeah. So there's still a lot to be distributed and for people to become familiar with and to get to know. Yeah. Right. Aficionados. Yeah. So.
Paul and I have something in common.
Yeah.
For me, it's music and CDs and LPs and cassettes, and they were all million sellers, and there are 1 million of them in my cellar.
Yeah. 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 Well, I mean, the art market, I mean, that's the strange thing about it, and this is where it becomes a politically fascinating project, because I immediately, after her death, went around to a few places, and none of them had any interest, and I speculate that it's because her art drew inspiration from from earlier periods. She was not part of the art society. I don't know how to quite put it. She was not part of any school of contemporary art, and she didn't promote herself, and so as a result, there were no sales, and the sales are what seem to give interest to museums. And if you have a record of sales, they're more interested in whether there have been sales than in the quality of the work, and that's one of the sort of tragedies of capitalism, you might say. They can't look at the work in its own right, but have to have a record of sales in order to take an interest in it. I mean, it's not totally that way, but there's so much of that we run into. I wrote to about 30 different museums within a radius of 100 or so miles of here a few months ago, and sent a very nice brochure we had, and not a single one even responded to me. I wrote them actually physical letters and then posted them, so with the brochure. They didn't even respond, so it's frustrating. Yeah.
Did any of your letters with your mother reveal her compass of how she saw herself as an artist? Where she wasn't taking any direction from any schools, but she actually had visions that were hers. So how did she, what was her compass?
The most important statement I found in a letter, which is one that I read in my other PowerPoint presentation, was where she saw it as an expression of what I am. That's quote unquote what I am, not who I am, but what I am. It was sort of full expression of herself, and she did often speak of the very much emotional suffering she had gone through in her life, and she certainly felt that her art was an outlet for that. But she did not speak of her art in relation to any trends or styles or that type of thing. So the closest thing to it was that phrase that Patricia quoted about her wanting to get away from figurative stuff and towards more abstract things. But it was an evolution within her own art. And I think you can say she was inspired by various other artists, but she was never part of a school. She was entirely really on her own. And in that sense, I sort of have recollections of her listening to discussions about art, but not really the one thing that she expressed was a kind of disdain for the purely geometric things, like a orange square on a green background or something like that. Yeah, she didn't think that was art. But apart from that, she was trying to create works of beauty, I would say, and so that was her main striving.
Well, thank you both. This has just been so great, and I'm just so proud that this will be on our archive of this event. The display and the exposition of these beautiful paintings. Just finally, just a run through of some great stuff coming up. Reverend Jason Leiden used to be our minister. He'll be here a week from tomorrow. A week from tomorrow, and he's a really young and dedicated anti-prison activist. But before that, Monday night we have a program about Hebron in the West Bank. It's 3 speakers from Hebron and an international accompaniment person who lives there and just watches the human rights abuse nightmare that unfolds and seems to get worse over the years in Hebron. That's this Monday at 7 p.m. Tuesday, there's We have a special luncheon for Jeff Halper, the activist from Jerusalem, who heads up the Israeli Committee to End Home Demolitions. And that's Tuesday at noon, if you want to join us and meet Jeff Halper. We also have upcoming a reading, these are Sundays, a reading of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland on the 100th anniversary of its publication by the Poets Theater. David Gillette is the leader of that. We have a talk by Mark Solomon, who has spoken here more than any other speaker. His talks at Community Church go back to the mid-60s, and he's 90 years old, and we're having, I hope people can join physically, we're having a luncheon in his honor, Mark and Pauline Solomon. That's on November 13th. And we have Trans Day of Remembrance featuring our good friend Letta Neely, who is an educator and friend who has spoken here before. That's the first time we're observing that, and we hope to do that every year. We have well represented in our past tenants and our new tenant who's about to move in, the LGBT community of the city of Boston. The new tenant is called the History Project. They document and archive LGBT history in Boston, a wonderful organization. We also have later in the month, I don't have the date in front of me, a program co-sponsorship with American Friends Service Committee on Gaza, 2 speakers from Gaza. We have Bob Datilio Day. I'll tell you about Bob. He passed away 2 years ago, November 27th. And we inherited a mountain of books and all of his research on the Sacco Vanzetti case. Check out our famous plaque of Vanzetti's quote. And Bob left us also an enormous amount of primary source material that he collected over his years of scholarly endeavor regarding the Sacco and Vanzetti case and early anarchism of the 20th century. And that's on November 27th. All kinds of great stuff. Take one of these home with you. And again, I want to thank you for being with us this afternoon, and join us tomorrow, virtually or physically, for John Pilger, filmmaker. We're going to watch an excerpt of his film that's called The Coming War on China. And then we'll have a Q&A with John himself joining us from England. And enjoy this auditorium, this space, and all the beautiful paintings and the wine and cheese that's still on the table. And we hope to see you again soon.
Could I just add an
Yes.
announcement about it? That in addition to paintings that we're trying to sell, we have posters.
Oh.
Sets of posters over there. We have 2 sets of posters. One, prints that were done by Diane Esmond herself, which are selling for $100, and the other, a poster of one of her gouache for $50. And of course, as mentioned before, all the proceeds go to the Community Church of Boston. So take a look and think about getting them. Yeah. Thank you.